Locked in a stone cell beneath the greatest arena ever built. Above you, 50,000 Romans just watched your husband die fighting a lion. The crowd is leaving. The torches are dimming. Then you hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming closer. A shadow fills your doorway. It's the gladiator who survived today's massacre. He's covered in blood that isn't his own. A guard unlocks your cell. The gladiator points at you. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This was Tuesday in the Roman Empire. What I'm about to show you is the part of Roman history they don't teach in schools. The systematic, state-sponsored nightmare that happened after the crowds went home. This isn't speculation. It's documented by Roman writers themselves. And the evidence is literally carved into the walls beneath the Colosseum. If you stay until the end, you'll never look at ancient Rome the same way again. Hollywood has been lying to you about gladiators for decades. Gladiator Spartacus. These films show you the blood and the combat, the honor and rebellion. What they don't show you is what happened in the hours after the games ended, when the public spectacle transformed into something far more sinister. I'm talking about a system so disturbing that modern historians created a new Latin term to describe it. Victoria carnales, the carnal victory. Now, the Romans themselves never called it that because to them it wasn't even remarkable enough to need a special name. It was just normal. Here's what we know for certain. Roman writers like Martial, Juvenal, and Seneca documented a world where conquered women were warehoused beneath arenas and distributed as prizes. Not metaphorically, literally handed out like rations to gladiators who performed well. The Roman state, the government itself, operated this system with the same bureaucratic efficiency they used to build aqueducts and roads. Think about that. The same civilization that gave us concrete and representative government also perfected the industrialization of sexual violence. Before we go deeper, I need you to do something. Look at the like button right now. If you believe hidden history deserves to be exposed, even when it's uncomfortable, hit that button and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Because this story isn't just about Rome. It's about what empires do when no one's looking. Now, let's descend into the hypergame. To understand what happened in those underground chambers, you have to first understand how Rome turned human beings into inventory. This wasn't random cruelty. This was systematic dehumanization on an industrial scale. And it started the moment Roman legions conquered new territory. When Rome crushed a rebellion in Gaul or annihilated a city in Judea, they didn't just win a battle, they processed an entire population. It was like a factory assembly, line for human suffering. Men of military age sent to die in mines or arenas.
Children sold to slave markets across the empire. Women designated as captivates, war prizes belonging to the states. Here's where it gets truly chilling. Under Roman law, these people weren't legally human anymore. They were classified as rest things, property. The same legal category as furniture or livestock. A conquered woman had no more rights than a chair. You could do anything to her, and it wasn't even technically a crime. Because you can't commit a crime against an object. But Rome didn't just dehumanize people through law. They dehumanized them through spectacle. The games weren't just entertainment. They were political theater designed to psychologically dominate both the conquered and Rome's own citizens. When you watched a captured Germanic chieftain fight a lion, you weren't just seeing a man die. You were watching Rome demonstrate what happens to anyone who defies the empire. And during the midday lull, when the elite left for lunch, That's when things got truly sadistic. Historians call these fatal charades mythological reenactments, where condemned prisoners were forced to act out famous myths, except the deaths were real. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century AD, describes these scenes with disturbing casualness, like he's reviewing a restaurant. He writes about a prisoner dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician who could charm any creature with his song. They led him into the arena. With a lyre released a bear. Martial notes, almost disappointed that this time the music didn't work, as the bear mauled the man to death while 50,000 people ate honeyed dates. In another passage, and I'm warning you, this is deeply disturbing, Martial describes a woman forced to reenact the myth of Pasiphae, who mated with a sacred bull. For this prisoner, it meant being publicly assaulted by an animal in front of thousands of spectators until she died from her injuries. Read that again. The Roman state designed a system where human beings were raped to death by animals as lunchtime entertainment. This wasn't the sick fantasy of one mad emperor. This was decades of standard operating procedure. Senators brought their children to watch. The events were advertised on walls throughout the city. Vendors sold snacks. Martial himself notes that whatever myth tells us, the arena makes real. But here's the thing that should terrify you. He's writing this as a compliment. He's praising the efficiency of the system. This was the environment. This industrialized, bureaucratic machinery of cruelty that also processed conquered women into the reward system for gladiators. Now, let's talk about the men who received these rewards. Gladiators existed in a bizarre contradiction that Rome never fully resolved. They were simultaneously the lowest and highest members of society, slaves with less legal status than a dog, but celebrities whose faces appeared on mosaics and whose names were graffitied on walls by adoring fans. Women of the aristocracy were obsessed with them. Ancient graffiti from Pompeii calls one gladiator the sigh of the girls, and another the glory of the ladies. There are documented cases of noble women sneaking into gladiator barracks, paying off guards for private encounters. The gladiator Sergius apparently had affairs with multiple married patrician women, causing enormous scandals. Even stranger, their bodily fluids were commodified. Gladiator sweat was collected after fights, mixed with olive oil, and sold as an aphrodisiac and beauty treatments. Think about that level of celebrity, worship. These are enslaved men whose perspiration is being bottled and marketed to the upper classes. But Rome lived in constant terror of these men. The Spartacus rebellion, which happened in 73 BC, was burned into Roman cultural memory. 78 gladiators had escaped, raised an army of 70,000, and nearly brought Rome to its knees. For 2 years, they humiliated legion after legion. When Rome finally crushed them, they crucified 6,000 survivors along the Ion Way. One body every 40 meters for 200 kilometers, a forest of crosses stretching from Rome to Capua. That trauma never left the Roman psyche. Every time a gladiator picked up a sword, every lanista who ran a gladiator school, every spectator in the stands, they all remembered that these men had once come terrifyingly close to burning Rome to the ground. So, how do you control incredibly dangerous, incredibly valuable men who have legitimate grievances and the combat skills to act on them? You use a combination of brutal punishment and calculated rewards. Extra food rations, prize money, freedom after enough victories. But the sources hint at something else.
something more primal: access to conquered women. The documentation here is frustratingly scattered. Roman writers mention it in passing, like it's too obvious to explain in detail. But when you piece together references from martial, juvenile, and later sources, a pattern emerges. After a particularly impressive victory, particularly during the major games, funded by the emperor or wealthy senators, gladiators who survived and fought well were given what ancient sources vaguely refer to as privileges of the victor. Modern historians, reading between the lines and cross-referencing with what we know about military rewards and slave management, believe this often meant access to female captives held beneath the arena. The process appears to have been chillingly bureaucratic. The gladiator would be brought down into the hypergyme, the vast underground network beneath the arena floor. Still wearing his armor, still covered in the blood and sand of the arena, a ludus official or an arena administrator would act as an escort. They'd walk through tunnels lit by oil lamps, past the animal cages and the mechanical lifts, until they reached a specific section of holding cells. These weren't general prison cells. Archaeological evidence from various amphitheaters across the empire, Capua, Pompeii, even beneath the Colosseum itself, reveals small chambers with distinctive features: stone benches, iron rings anchored into walls at waist height and near the floor, doors that lock from the outside. Some rooms show evidence of chains permanently mounted to the architecture. The women held in these cells were called captive idamnati, condemned war captives. They'd already been processed through Rome's bureaucracy of conquest. Their names were recorded in ledgers by officials called a commentary, who tracked state property. Each woman was assigned a number and a category based on her origin: Germanica, Britannica, Parthica. The gladiator would be shown a row of cells. Some accounts suggest he could choose. Others imply women were simply assigned, like equipment being checked out of a warehouse. Either way, a guard would unlock the designated cell. The woman would be brought out, or the gladiator would enter. The door would be locked again. What happened next isn't described in explicit detail in surviving sources, but it doesn't take much imagination. The architecture tells the story, the texts won't. Here's what makes this especially sinister. This wasn't a crime. It wasn't even viewed as morally questionable by most Romans. This was part of the operational budget of the games. The logistics of Victoria Carnalis were handled by the same administrators who scheduled animal fights and maintained arena equipment. From the state's perspective, this system solved multiple problems elegantly. It rewarded loyal gladiators cheaply. Conquered women cost the state nothing, as they were already classified as spoils of war. It reinforced the gladiator's sense of power and privilege without actually giving him any real freedom or authority. And it sent a message to both the gladiator and the conquered people. This is what Roman dominance means. Your victory in the arena earns you the same right the emperor has: absolute power over the conquered. One Roman writer, whose name is lost but whose work is quoted by later historians, put it bluntly: the victor claims his prize in the same manner the empire claims its provinces, by right of conquest. Let's talk about the physical spaces where this happened, because the archaeology is damning. When archaeologists first excavated beneath the Colosseum in the 19th century, they were primarily interested in the impressive engineering, the elevator systems that lifted animals to arena level, the complex tunnels for moving personnel and equipment. But as excavations continued, they found something they didn't expect: specialized chambers that served no obvious logistical purpose. These rooms are small, typically 10 to 15 square meters. They're located in a separate section of the hyperg, away from animal cages and gladiator, ready rooms. Their distinctive features are what make modern archaeologists uncomfortable. Stone benches line the walls, but unlike benches in other chambers, these are
built at a specific height. Iron rings are anchored into the walls at multiple heights, some at floor level, some at waist height, some higher. The doors are heavy wood, reinforced with iron, and they lock from the outside. The walls in several chambers show evidence of scratching, desperate fingernails trying to dig through solid stone. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century AD, mentions that beneath major amphitheaters were chambers for those awaiting their use. The phrasing is deliberately vague, but in context, he's discussing the logistics of the games, specifically the management of human resources. But the most disturbing evidence comes from graffiti. In the Hypergeum, beneath the amphitheater in Capua, the same city where Spartacus launched his rebellion, archaeologists found scratch marks on cell walls. Some are in Latin, others in languages from across the empire. Most are fragmentary, but a few are legible. One, written in crude Latin by someone clearly not a native speaker, translates roughly to, "I was Amelia of the Bagantes. I saw my children killed. Now I am nothing." Another, in what appears to be Celtic, has been translated as, "To any god who listens, let me die before tomorrow." These aren't the voices history typically preserves. Roman chronicles name emperors and generals, track military victories and architectural achievements. They don't record the names of conquered women catalogued as property. But the stones remember. The architecture itself tells us something crucial. This system was designed for efficiency and repetition. These weren't improvised assault locations. They were purpose-built, maintained facilities with specific design features meant to facilitate what happened inside them. Compare this to how Rome handled other aspects of gladiatorial management, and the pattern becomes clear. Gladiator barracks, animal facilities, weapons storage. Every element of the arena infrastructure was carefully planned and standardized across the empire. The captive chambers fit the same pattern. This was state-sponsored infrastructure for systematic abuse. Some historians argue we shouldn't read too much into these chambers, that they could have been used for various purposes, that we're projecting modern concerns onto ambiguous evidence. But when you combine the architecture with the literary references, the pattern of Roman military culture, and basic logic about how the system functioned, the picture becomes painfully clear. Now we have to confront the hardest part of this story: what this actually meant for the women trapped in this system. History is almost completely silent on their individual experiences. We don't have diaries, we don't have testimony. What we have are ledgers that list them as numbers, and property inventories that describe them like livestock. Female Germanic, approximately 20 years, good health, assigned to Colosseum holding. But we can reconstruct the nightmare from what we do know about the conquest process. These women weren't random prisoners. They came from specific contexts of absolute trauma. When Rome conquered a region that resisted, say during the Dacian Wars or the suppression of the Britannic Revolt led by Boudicca, the aftermath was methodical Roman military procedure dictated that after the final battle, the civilian population would be processed. Men of fighting age were killed or enslaved for hard labor. Children under a certain age
were separated and sold to slave markets in the East, where they'd never see their homeland or families again. Women of childbearing age were designated as captive and transported in chains to holding facilities. For a woman in this situation, the journey to the arena was already a descent through multiple circles of hell. You'd watched your village burn. You'd seen your children torn from your arms, screaming. You'd been chained to dozens of other women and marched hundreds of miles to Rome. You'd been stripped, examined like livestock, assigned a number, and locked in a cell beneath the greatest monument to the civilization that destroyed it. Everything you knew. The waiting was its own form of torture. You could hear everything, the roar of the crowd above, as people you might have known were executed in creative ways for entertainment. The screams of animals being slaughtered, the cheers when a gladiator delivered a particularly skillful killing blow. And you knew you'd never leave. There was no ransom system, no prisoner exchange. Rome didn't negotiate with the conquered. Your people back home, if they even survived, would never know what happened to you. You'd simply disappear into the machinery of empire. Then came the footsteps, the cell door opening, the choice being made, the door closing and locking again with you on the wrong side of it, with a man who just spent the afternoon killing people for entertainment. Roman law provided no protection. You couldn't appeal to magistrates because legally you weren't a person. You couldn't even commit suicide, one of the few escapes Roman culture sometimes viewed with respect, because if you somehow managed it, you'd be depriving the state of its property, and your body would still be used, just differently. This was psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. The humiliation of conquered women wasn't a side effect of Roman military policy, it was a deliberate strategy. The goal was to break the spirit of resistance so thoroughly that future generations wouldn't even dare to think about defying Rome. Ancient sources make this explicit. After crushing the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, the historian Josephus records that Romans deliberately took Jewish women to be distributed among the legions and the games, specifically to demonstrate to survivors that not only had they lost their sovereignty, but they'd lost any ability to protect their families. The message was clear: resisting Rome, and this is what happens to your daughters. But occasionally this system broke in unexpected ways. For all its industrialized cruelty, Rome was obsessed with maintaining certain fictions about itself. The empire saw itself as bringing civilization and order to the barbarian world. This self-image required that some horrors remain hidden. Which brings us to an event that forced the system into uncomfortable visibility: female gladiators. On extremely rare occasions, women fought in the arena itself. Ancient sources are conflicted about who these women were. Some were clearly slaves, forced to fight, but others appear to have been noble women who, in a culture that gave women almost no agency, saw the arena as a perverse form of power and celebrity. The very existence of gladiatrices scandalized Rome's elite. The satist Juvenal wrote with dripping contempt about aristocratic women who trained with gladiator weapons, writing, "What sense of shame can be found in a woman who wears a helmet?" In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Seus attended games in Antioch that featured female fighters. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who was present, something unexpected happened. The Greek audience reacted with shock and discomfort, treating the fights with the solemnity they'd give male gladiators. But the Roman spectators, they jeered, shouted sexual comments, and treated the entire event as an obscene joke. The female fighters weren't seen as warriors. They were seen as a sexual spectacle, accidentally placed in a venue meant for death combat. Caius was reportedly mortified, not by the violence itself, but by how crudely his fellow Romans reacted. The dignity of the games, his propaganda tool, was being undermined by the audience's inability to separate violence from sex when women were involved. So, he banned women from fighting in the arena entirely. Think about what this tells us. The problem wasn't protecting women from violence. Female captivity was still being held in chambers beneath this very arena. The problem was that the violence had become too visible, too public, in a way that made Rome's self-image uncomfortable. The emperor was fine with the abuse. He just wanted it to happen in the shadows where it belonged. The abuse didn't stop after Cyrus's ban. It just returned to the darkness of the hypergame, where it had always primarily operated. Anyway, here's what should truly disturb you. This system didn't end with some moral awakening. The games continued for centuries, even after Rome officially converted to Christianity in the 4th century AD. The gladiatorial games persisted for decades. The last recorded gladiatorial combat happened in 404 AD, when a monk named Telemachus jumped into the arena to stop a fight and was torn apart by an outraged crowd. Only then did Emperor Honorius permanently ban gladiatorial combat. But even that didn't end the system of captivity beneath the arenas. The infrastructure remained. The practice of taking war captives remained standard military procedure throughout the Byzantine period. The system eventually faded not because of moral progress, but because the Roman Empire itself collapsed. The machinery of conquest stopped, so the supply of captives dried up. The institution died from lack of resources, not from ethical evolution. Today, when tourists visit the Colosseum, they take selfies in front of magnificent arches and marvel at ancient engineering. Tour guides talk about gladiatorial combat and animal hunts. Most never mention what happened in the chambers below. The stones are still there. Those rings bolted into the walls haven't rusted away. The scratch marks from desperate fingernails are still preserved beneath centuries of dust. The ledgers that recorded human beings as inventory items are stored in Vatican archives and museums across Europe, available to anyone who wants to read them. We're not talking about a few isolated incidents. This was policy. This was infrastructure. This was normal. The Colosseum stands as a monument to what empire actually means. Not just the grand architecture and military victories we celebrate, but the industrialized horror required to maintain absolute power. Every stone in that arena was bought with more than money. It was bought with lives deliberately destroyed in the most systematic ways humans have ever devised. The spectacle on the sand was only the half of it that Rome wanted you to see. The other half happened in those chambers beneath your feet, in the moments after the crowd's roar faded into silence. Those voices, the ones that weren't supposed to be preserved, the ones Roman chroniclers didn't think worth recording, are still there in those walls if you're willing to listen. And that's the story
they don't teach in history class. If this exposed something you've never heard before, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep uncovering the history they tried to erase. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next investigation into the darkest corners of the past.